This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey, everyone. It's Mark Bayer, and thank you so much for being with us on this episode of When Science Speaks. Today's episode is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional lives. And that journey often requires the effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication to capture the attention of general audiences. If you are interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that, go to ComplexityMadeClear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's ComplexityMadeClear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, but not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for general audiences. It is such a great pleasure to have Lisa Fain on the show today. Lisa is the CEO of Center for Mentoring Excellence and founder of Vista Coaching, the coaching division of the center. Her passion for diversity and inclusion work is fueled by her strong conviction that leveraging differences creates better workplaces and drives better business results. Lisa coaches, mentors, mentees, and program administrators on how to achieve mentoring excellence and create the right environment for achievement of career and personal goals. She's highly regarded for her special combination of knowledge, expertise, humor, and a no-nonsense practical approach. Previously, Lisa served as Senior Director of the Diversity and Inclusion Function at Outerwall, which is the parent company of Redbox and Coinstar. She's practiced law with the Chicago office of a major multinational law firm and counseled employers on creating inclusive policies and practices. Lisa has her BS in social policy from Northwestern University and a JD degree from Northwestern University School of Law. She's an executive coach and has completed her certification from the International Coach Academy. Welcome to the show, Lisa. It is wonderful to have you here.
Thanks, Mark. So good to be here.
You know, going through your bio, one of the themes that emerges of your professional journey so far is a real passion for reducing or avoiding conflict in the first place and creating inclusive, productive workplaces. Where do you think that interest is rooted? Meaning sort of how did you get interested in this specialized area in the first place?
I would say that it really has two roots. The first goes back to law school. As you mentioned in the introduction, I spent a lot of years practicing law. Mm-hmm. And in law school, I took a class on mediation. In mediation, I learned that the most important thing is to identify the needs and interests of both parties. And when I would, from that, I became a certified mediator. And as I was mediating disputes, what I learned, or the realization that I came to, is that so much of this conflict could have been prevented if people had really just communicated in the first place. And it was often the conflicts that I mediated, initially at least, were neighborhood disputes and things like that. And it grew to, when I started practicing law, conflict in the workplace. But it was about people not understanding one another, not really seeing one another, not understanding what their needs and interests were and what their motivations were. And so that really struck me. And then as I started to practice law and I would, litigate employment disputes or counsel clients on, employment disputes, what I would see is that if people had gotten to know one another, if they had taken the time to really communicate more clearly and not make assumptions about one another, so much of the expensive and exhausting costs of litigation could have been avoided. And so it really drove that belief and caused me to focus now on how do you develop relationships that help build people's competencies to avoid conflict. And really, I wouldn't just say avoid conflict, but also embrace conflict and learn how to work through conflict. Because the other piece was a lot of times the second that there was some sort of agitation or irritation, people would overblow it into something that was, colossal, as opposed to building the trust where they can work through conflict. So
fascinating. So much there. Why do you think it is hard for people? I would call that sort of connection, developing these connections on a human level, and using that to help inform some of this communication that you felt was lacking. You must have seen this sort of pattern, happen a lot as part of your experience practicing law and before that. And any thoughts on why? Like, why as humans we don't do a better job at that? Because as you said, the stakes of not doing it are so high in expense and agitation and, all the bad things that go along with that.
Well, I think there's a couple things. The first is I think we have, epidemic in this country, which is of wanting to, of multitasking and not being where our feet are or our rear end is. And so we don't take the time to really stop and read all the other signals. Mm-hmm. That would be sort of thing one. And thing two is we're all, because we're human, inclined to be attracted to sameness and retreat from ways in which we're different because, either we're told not to talk about it or it feels uncomfortable. And so we haven't taken the time to really get curious when there's differences. And so when those differences, I'm using air quotes here, kind of get in the way, right? Mm-hmm. Meaning that they become something that's not understood or they appear to be an obstacle. We judge those differences. We, evaluate those differences. We get angry about those differences and we use them as a reason not to connect as opposed to what they should be, which is a reason to a spark to get more curious and to connect, because of those differences.
Yeah, I love how you talked about curiosity because as I look at this, it almost seems to me like, yes, there are differences, but if you are curious and you do authentically look for similarities, we humans do like that, then you're probably going to find some things that you actually, some common ground, some things that you're very similar about. And if you're more comfortable, we're more comfortable dealing when we have that kind of reflection back to us of things that we recognize in ourselves.
Yeah. I often say when I'm talking to groups, that we've all heard and been taught that this phrase that we have in our parlance, which is that we connected despite our differences, is this great thing. And I'd love to just get rid of that entirely and replace it with we connected because of our differences. Because the more we think of something, of connection as something that happens only across similarity, the less inclined we are to explore what those differences are and get curious about them and dig deep and learn from them. So I think we're like-minded in that, Mark.
Interesting. Let me ask you now, because so many of our listeners are in academia and they're interacting with a mentor or advisor. You have so much expertise and experience from a variety of perspectives in this area. I'm wondering what some of the common pitfalls are or missed opportunities that you often see, let's just say mentees experience for this, this particular part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the most common that I see is a lack of agency and ownership in your own mentoring relationship for mentees. So here's what I mean by that. Really effective mentoring relationships are ones where the mentor and the mentee co-create the terms of that relationship. Mm-hmm. So, I'll often say, 1 + 1 = 3. In a mentoring relationship, there's the mentor, the mentee, and the mentoring relationship, these three things. And so the mistake that mentees make is because there's a power imbalance in, between mentor and mentee, the mentees sit back and they wait for their mentors to define what the parameters of the relationship are. And when they do that, it could go well. But it also often is a misalignment of what needs and expectations are and preferences. And so, I'll talk to mentors and mentees halfway through their mentoring period, and they'll say, we just don't get each other, or it fizzled, or what have you. And I say, well, did you have a conversation about co-creating the terms of your relationships? And the mentee will often say, no, I didn't do that. I thought that was the mentor's job. Mm-hmm. So that's thing number one. And the way to do that is to have a conversation with them about what are the ground rules of our relationship. How often are we going to meet? Who's going to set an agenda? What kinds of stuff are we going to be talking about? Mm-hmm. How are we going to invite feedback? Which is really like one of the most beautiful things about mentoring is that it is a time it's a space to have safe, deep feedback, actually both ways, between mentor and mentee to mentor and mentor to mentee. And if you've not set those parameters up front, I think mentees will find that they have not made the most of their mentoring relationship. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge missed opportunity is, the part that I just said in terms of mentees giving feedback to their mentors, that feedback is about the quality of the relationship. So if I were your mentee, I could say, Mark, this relationship isn't going quite the way I had planned. I had really hoped we would talk more about goals, or, we need to meet a little more infrequently so I can get my commitments to you done in between, and that kind of thing. And me as the mentee, knowing that you are not going to, get defensive about mm-hmm. that or mm-hmm. find that troublesome, but that you really invite that feedback, and the ability to give that feedback by the mentee and the ability to take that feedback by the mentor is something that you see in really successful mentoring relationships.
Such an important point. And I'm going to ask you a question about what mentees should look for in a mentor. Clearly, the ability, the comfort level, the self-confidence associated with getting feedback from someone who is junior to you.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the way the relationship is set up. But it also, something you just said, Lisa, made me think, I wonder, sort of from your experience, what percentage roughly of mentor-mentee relationships do you think have that kind of dynamic?
Oh, gosh. It's a hard question to answer, and I'll tell you why it's a hard question to answer. Because the term mentoring is used promiscuously. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And by that, I mean, a lot of the things that people call mentoring relationships aren't really mentoring relationships. They're something else. Mm-hmm. They're coaching relationships or they're advising relationships or something else. So, but if I were to guess, my guess is between 15 and 20% of mentoring relationships, and I'm pulling this number out of the mm-hmm. air, but based on my experience, actually take the time to set agreements, create a work plan, focus on goals, talk about how to invite feedback, and then invite that feedback. It's pretty rare. And the differences in outcomes between those that do and those that don't are just exponential.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I understand it. Yeah, I wanted to get a rough sense. I didn't even know what the overall universe is, as you pointed out, depending on how you define mentorship. Well, other than comfort in getting feedback, what should mentees look for in a mentor?
Yeah. So, I guess there's two ways to answer that question. One is what should they look for in terms of outcome, and the other is what should they look for in terms of skills. Mm-hmm. So let me start with the first, which is what should they look for in terms of outcome. And it's going to be, my answer is a very unsatisfying, it depends, mm-hmm. Because mentoring is at its heart a goal-focused, goal-centered, I should say, developmental relationship. And so what they should look for is the setting of and the achievement of their goals, whatever that is. I know mm-hmm. in your world, among many of your listeners, we're talking about academia. Mm-hmm. And so maybe it's getting published. Maybe it is, becoming tenured. Or maybe it's the development of some skill. But whatever that is, it really needs to be something that is goal focused. So that's what I would say in terms of outcome. In terms of skill or attribute that makes a mentor a fit for a mentee, I often say to mentees or prospective mentees who are looking for mentors, before you try to determine who your mentor should be, determine what it is you want to learn. Because when you choose a mentor, you want it to be a learning fit. A learning fit. So is this somebody who can guide you in a goal that's focused on what it is you want to learn and, significantly, how you learn best? And then once you have done the work to determine who that would be for what those skills are for you, then you can start to think about who might fit that description. Much like hiring, right? You don't first say, I want to hire Mark Bayer. You want to first know what you want to hire you for, right? What is the job description? And then you find somebody who's a good fit for that. And so that is really, really, really important. A lot of mentees try to find a mentor with sameness. Sameness being, in personal attributes, gender, sexual orientation, race, national origin. Sameness could be in terms of background. Sameness could be in terms of expertise. But I think that there's great value in having mentoring relationships across difference. And that's really where I've been focusing most of my time and thinking lately is how do you, is the importance and the growth that can come from mentoring relationships across difference for both the mentor and the mentee.
I love it. I really love that. We've been talking sort of in a construct that's academic, as you referred to, and I want to ask you about this now. Let's take scientists, for example. Those who decide to apply their degree outside academia, they may be interested in industry or policy, startups, all these different opportunities. Mentorship may be much less formalized in that type of corporate or government environment compared to campus environment, for example. And so I'm wondering, since so many scientists look for meaningful career journeys outside academia, and obviously some are want to stay in academia, but for those who decide that they'd like to go outside academia, how should they, sort of in this new setting, how should they approach mentorship, as far as identifying, seeking it at work, where there may not be any kind of formal process or program?
Yeah. So let's start with how they should not do it, because I think it will help answer the question of how they should. And the way they should not do it is the way that so many people do it, which is they go into a corporate environment, there's no formal mentorship program, and they look to establish a mentorship relationship with their direct supervisor or their direct supervisor's supervisor. Mm-hmm. This is a mistake. And the reason that this is a mistake is that in order to have an effective mentoring relationship, you have to have full psychological safety, full safety to show up with your warts and your challenges and all of those things. And you want to be able to be focused on your development, not your day-to-day performance. And the role of a supervisor is to evaluate their employee and, obviously award compensation commensurate with that. But also their ultimate accountability is the performance of the mentee. And the mentee's interest may end up being aligned with what their job role is, or it may not. And so you really want to not look in your direct line of supervision. So that's what not to do. Mm-hmm. In terms of what to do, there's always seeing if there's a formal mentorship program, but I think your question is really about what happens when that does not exist.
Right.
And so it goes back to identifying what it is you want to learn. One role your supervisor can play is to have in your one-on-one meeting with your supervisor to say, I'm looking for a mentor outside of the line of supervision to start to develop some relationships within this organization, or so I can learn more about organizational savvy, or I can learn more about whatever it is you want to learn. Who do you recommend I talk to? So that's a great way to start. The other is to start to ask around, and as you develop relationships with coworkers, to say, I'm realizing that, this organization that I've joined is heavy into manufacturing, and I don't know that much about the overall manufacturing process. Who's an expert on that in this organization? And then to start to approach that person. I often say that it's best not to approach someone right away and say, will you mentor me? Because it's like saying, will you marry me on the first date, right?
Exactly.
It's like, Mark, I know you're really great at building communities. I want to learn more about community building. Hey, can I treat you to a cup of coffee or a virtual cup of coffee and just learn more about how you do that? And then in the course of that conversation, I can assess whether there might be a fit here, whether it's something, we may want to learn more about together, whether I want to explore mentorship with you, and so forth. But asking for mentorship out of the blue is like asking for marriage on the first date, and it can be both intimidating and lead to results where there's not a lead to circumstances where there's not a learning result.
Right. Yeah, that's a great analogy. It's so true. You mentioned this earlier, just touched upon it, Lisa, is we hear a lot about mentors and coaches and career conversations. What are the similarities and differences between the two?
I'm just going to pause for a quick second, Mark, because they're vacuuming right over my head and it's going to interfere. Yeah. So just give it, I don't know if you can pick up on that. But let's just wait.
Lisa, we hear a lot about mentors and coaches and career conversations. What are the similarities and also the differences between the two?
Such a great question, and probably the question I get asked most often, Mark. So there's definitely overlap between mentoring and coaching. And, so what we like to say is that all mentors are coaches, but not all coaches are mentors. Mm-hmm. So here's what I mean by that. Mentoring is, or let's start with coaching. Coaching is something that is usually pretty discrete. It's based on a particular learning, and it is driven by the coach. So if you were to ask me to hire me to be your coach to help you set a 10-year vision, and you came to the coaching session and I said, I don't have any tools, I just have good questions, you would feel like I wasn't a particularly effective coach, right? That's what I hired you for. So coaches bring the tools, they bring the knowledge to help guide a discrete goal of the client or of the coachee. Mentoring is something that is more long-term and developmental, and it is a mentee-driven process. So the mentor's job is not to have the answers. The mentor's job is to have the right questions. And they can use their knowledge and their experience to ask the right questions and help guide the mentee. So mentors might use some coaching skills to get to that, but it's all in service of the development. It's not in service of more short-term, discrete performance goals.
So clear. Thank you for that. It's really the first time I've understood the difference and the distinction there. And it's a nice way also to underline some of the important points that you made earlier in our discussion. As we wrap up, Lisa, COVID's shaking up the way everyone works and resetting expectations about when and where and how employees are going to work. In these uncertain times, it seems like having a mentor would be even more important as workers are navigating totally new norms. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's interesting because as we record this, it's, August of 2021. And I kind of think back as you asked that question to what it's been like since March of 2020 when work was just shaken up. And I can remember between about March and June or July of 2020, clients would say, or even prospective clients would say, we're just going to wait. We're going to wait and see because we're going to get back together and people don't really need it right now. And they're too remote anyway, and it can't work. And all of a sudden, about this time last year, June or July or August of last year, people started to realize, actually, no, we need this connection more than ever. It's really hard to foster a collaborative workplace culture. It's very hard to create engagement. It's very hard to foster inclusive conversations when you are remote. And so mentoring is a great way to do that. Even before COVID, we were working with global organizations where mentors and mentees were on not just in different time zones, but different continents. And we were able to see success because the way we guided mentors and mentees is it's so important. And it's always been important, but it's even more important now to take time to really connect and learn about one another and one's environment and concerns, and really go more deep on connecting when you are virtual. Mm-hmm. And so, not to let perfect be the enemy of the good, right? And by that I mean so many of us would prefer in-person communication, but it's just not always possible. And so, having the frequent connection points, the frequent reach outs, the conversations that maybe I'm actually exhausted about being on Zoom or video conference all day. So what we can do, would it be okay with you, Mark, as my mentor, if we had a walking mentoring meeting where we both go for a walk and talk through earbuds? Mm-hmm. Instead of meeting, bi-weekly by Zoom, we'll meet once a month by Zoom, and, we'll agree to set accountabilities that we can follow up with by email or text in between. And send each other an article and do some reading together, or whatever it is additional ways to connect are so, so, so important. We're finding so much isolation and so much disenchantment, disengagement, that having mentoring right now is so important. And actually it's easier than ever to have multiple mentoring relationships because we don't have to travel to those engagements, because they're not necessarily an hour and a half commitment each time. Maybe they're shorter. That it's a great time to initiate and to continue a mentoring relationship.
Lisa, you also mentioned in some ways that, it's a mentor-mentee relationship, right? And not all relationships work out, as we know, regardless of the context. So what is the best way to handle breaking up with your mentor, so to speak?
Yeah. So again, maybe best to start with what's the worst way, which is to just let it fizzle, right? Mm-hmm. There's been plenty of mentees with whom we've worked who have, even mentors for that matter, who've said, I just never followed up to schedule the next meeting. Mm. That's a missed opportunity. It's a missed opportunity to build a bridge for a continued relationship in another way. It's really burning the bridge and the opportunity to connect with this person or seek information for this person or have this person, in your kitchen cabinet down the line. And so the way to do it is to do a couple things. Number one, celebration of what you have achieved together if you're already been in the relationship. Appreciation for the time that you've spent, and then a candid conversation. And by the way, this is so much easier when you've had ground rules or a setting agreements conversation like we talked about before. But just to say, Mark, we've been meeting for a few months now, and when we first met, we talked about, working on, my goal of creating communities. That's not been something we've been able to work on or focus on, and I'm finding that I don't have the time, or it's just not been an area that we've been able to prioritize. And so I'm thinking that, maybe what we ought to do is to think about this relationship differently. Would it be okay if I come to you occasionally to ask questions about blah, 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 and we just restructure our relationship accordingly? Something like that, where it's really clear about the reason why, you're showing appreciation. Maybe it's just that there's not chemistry. And so I wouldn't necessarily say there's no chemistry between us. That feels a little awkward, right? Mm-hmm. But you might say I'm not sure that it's been a good use of my time or yours, and or that we've gotten out of it what we had hoped to get out of it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that as well. And maybe we can agree that it's time to bring the relationship to a close and, again, redefine what it looks like moving forward.
Yep. Great. And as you alluded to, it all that conversation so much easier if you have done that preparatory work at the very beginning.
Yeah. I mentioned one danger is to just not follow up. The other is to just keep showing up and have it fizzle and be unsatisfactory. And that's as bad, right? I mean, it's not a good use of anybody's time. It leads to frustration. And, that's not good either. So it is truly a developmental skill to be able to provide feedback about a relationship and to end it constructively. And having a closure conversation is a critical step in the mentoring cycle.
Great. Thank you for elaborating on that. It's a situation a lot of people find themselves in, and you've really provided the framework and the specific words that somebody could use if they do find themselves having to break up with their mentor, so to speak.
My pleasure.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.